In the autumn of 2012, a young lawyer named Jake McAllister sat alone in the back office of a small law firm in San Angelo, Texas. The room smelled of old leather and cedar. A ceiling fan turned slowly above his head, stirring the warm air without cooling it. On the desk before him lay an envelope. It had arrived that morning from a legal office in Yokohama, Japan, and it carried the weight of something he did not yet understand. The letter inside was formal, typed on crisp paper and translated into precise English. It informed him that a woman named Sachiko Tanaka had died at the age of 88. She had no surviving spouse. She had one granddaughter, and she had left her entire estate modest but meaningful to the McAllister family of San Angelo, Texas. A family she had never met. A family she had never written to. A family connected to her by something that happened 67 years earlier on a cattle ranch outside this very town. Jake read the letter twice. He did not recognize the name. He called his mother. She did not recognize it either. No one in the family had ever mentioned a Japanese woman named Sachiko Tanaka. His grandfather, Thomas McAllister, had passed away in 1987, and the old man had carried his silences to the grave the way most men of his generation did. He spoke about cattle. He spoke about weather. He never spoke about the war. Inside the envelope beneath the letter, Jake found a small parcel wrapped in tissue paper. He opened it carefully. Inside were three objects. The first was a wooden comb, hand-carved crack down the middle, but held together with a thin strip of cloth, as though someone had tried to mend it and then decided the break was part of its story. The second was a leather-bound diary, its cover worn smooth by decades of handling, its pages filled with dense Japanese characters, and in the margins, trembling English words written in pencil. The third was a single sheet of paper folded once with a message written in English, so shaky it looked like it had been composed during an earthquake. It read, "Because they gave me back my name." Jake stared at those 7 words for a long time. He turned the paper over, nothing else. He opened the diary to the first page. The date was written in both Japanese and English. October 14th, 1945. Below it, in that same unsteady hand, someone had translated the opening line. "Today they made us line up. I was ready to die. But instead of death, they handed me a dress." Jake closed the diary. He looked out the window at the Texas sky, and pale and endless, the same sky his grandfather had looked at every morning for 60 years. And he understood, without knowing the details yet, that this diary held a story his grandfather had chosen never to tell. A story that began in the last months of 1945, when the war was over, but its wounds were still fresh and bleeding on this very land, under this very sky. To understand what happened on that ranch and why a woman carried a broken comb across an ocean for 67 years, we have to go back to a military transport ship cutting through the gray Pacific in October of 1945. Back to a steel hull groaning against the waves. Back to 23 women huddled below deck in a space that smelled of diesel fuel, salt water, and fear. The war had ended 2 months earlier. Emperor Hirohito's voice had crackled through radios across the Pacific on August 15th, announcing surrender, and the world had exhaled. But for the women below deck on that ship, the war had not ended. It had merely changed shape. They were not soldiers. They were not prisoners of war in any legal sense. They were the remnants of a system so brutal that even decades later, most nations would struggle to find words for it. They had been taken from their homes, their schools, their villages, and forced into service as comfort women for the Imperial Japanese Army. The word comfort was a lie wrapped in silk. There was no comfort in what they endured, only survival. And now, having survived the war, they faced a new terror. They were being shipped to America. Among them was a young woman named Sachiko Tanaka. She was 22 years old, though she looked older. Her cheekbones pressed sharp against her skin. Her hair, once thick and black, hung thin and brittle past her shoulders. Her eyes, dark and watchful, moved constantly, tracking every sound, every shadow, every shift in the air around her. It was the gaze of someone who had learned that danger could come from any direction, and usually did. Before the war, Sachiko had been a second-year medical student at Tokyo Women's Medical University, one of the few institutions in Japan that admitted women to study medicine. She had wanted to be a surgeon. She had steady hands and a quiet mind, and a gift for seeing patterns where others saw chaos. In 1943, the military had pulled her from the lecture hall and sent her to Okinawa as a field nurse. 6 months later, when the front lines collapsed and the army ran out of men to throw at the Americans, Sachiko was reassigned, not to another hospital, not to another unit, to the comfort system. Her medical knowledge did not save her. Nothing saved any of them. But it gave her something the others did not have: a clinical eye, a way of observing the world as though she were reading a patient's chart, noting symptoms, measuring vital signs, keeping her emotions behind a wall of data. It was the only armor she had left. She sat in the darkest corner of the ship's lower deck, her back against the cold steel wall, a small notebook pressed against her knee. She wrote in it every night, not because she believed anyone would read it, but because writing made things real. And if she stopped making things real, she was afraid she would disappear entirely. Across the narrow aisle, a girl named Haruko Miyazaki lay curled on her bunk fingers, moving restlessly over a scrap of paper. Haruko was 19. She came from Yokohama, the daughter of a fisherman who had lost his boat and then his hope in the early years of the war. A recruiter had come to their village in 1942 promising factory work. Haruko was 16. She believed him. By the time she understood the truth, there was no door to walk back through. Now she wrote constantly, compulsively, as though the act of recording every detail was the only thing keeping her tethered to herself. At the far end of this row of bunks, standing rigid against the bulkhead, with her spine as straight as a blade, was Noriko Watanabe, 21 years old, daughter of Lieutenant Watanabe of the Imperial Japanese Navy, who had gone down with his ship during the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October of 1944. Noriko did not cry. Noriko did not tremble. Noriko did not speak to the other women unless it was to remind them of what they had lost. She wore her father's death like a coat of iron, and she believed with absolute conviction that surrender was worse than death, that capture was the ultimate disgrace, and that every woman on this ship should have followed the example of the 1,000 women who had thrown themselves off the cliffs of Saipan rather than fall into American hands. Sachiko watched Noriko carefully, not with fear, but with the focused attention of a doctor observing a patient who might at any moment do something irreversible. Near the door, sitting cross-legged on the floor with an expression of deliberate calm, was Kazuko Shimizu. At 25, she was the oldest of the group. She came from Kyoto, and before the war she had been a geisha trained in the arts of conversation observation and reading the subtle currents of human emotion. She had not chosen the comfort system any more than the others had, but she had survived it differently. Where the younger women shattered, Kazuko bent. She learned a few words of English from the Western officers she encountered. She learned to read faces. She learned that sometimes the most powerful thing a person could do was simply remain calm when everyone else was falling apart. Now she sat by the door and watched the American Marines who guarded them, studying their movements, their expressions, their habits, the way a hunter studies the landscape before deciding whether to run or stay. And in the farthest corner, pressed against the wall as though trying to push herself through it, and out the other side was Fumiko Nakamura, 16 years old, the youngest. She lay with her face turned to the steel, her knees drawn to her chest. Her body curled so tightly she seemed to be trying to fold herself out of existence. Fumiko did not eat. Fumiko did not drink unless someone placed a cup directly in her hand. Fumiko did not speak. She had not spoken a single word since the day the Americans found her wandering alone on a road outside Okinawa, barefoot, covered in dust, staring at nothing. Sachiko recognized the symptoms. Acute psychological trauma, possibly selective mutism triggered by an event so overwhelming that the mind simply shut down the voice to protect itself. What that event was, no one knew. Fumiko could not tell them, and no one dared to ask. The night before the ship reached the port of Galveston, Sachiko woke in the dark to the sound of footsteps, soft, deliberate, moving toward the upper deck. She opened her eyes and saw Noriko climbing the metal ladder, her silhouette sharp against the faint light from above. Sachiko's stomach tightened. She rose without a sound and followed. She found Noriko standing at the railing of the upper deck, staring down at the black water. The ocean stretched in every direction, featureless, infinite, swallowing the moonlight whole. The wind was cold. Noriko's hair whipped across her face. Her hands gripped the railing. She did not look at Sachiko. She did not acknowledge her presence. Sachiko did not speak. She simply stood beside Noriko, close enough that their shoulders almost touched, and looked out at the same black water. They stayed like that for a long time. Minutes, maybe an hour. The ship rocked gently beneath them. The engines hummed. Somewhere below, a Marine coughed in his sleep. Noriko did not jump. When the first gray light of dawn appeared on the horizon, she released the railing, turned and walked back down the ladder without a word. Sachiko stood alone on the deck and watched the coastline of America materialize out of the mist, a thin dark line between water and sky, growing slowly inevitably, like a sentence being written across the world. That morning, as the ship entered the harbor, Sachiko leaned close to Haruko and whispered two words, "Watch her." Haruko nodded, but neither of them knew that the real danger was not waiting inside the group. It was waiting on land in the form of a man they had never met carrying a grief that had turned to stone. The journey from the port of Galveston to the outskirts of San Angelo took nearly a full day by military truck. The women sat on wooden benches in the back, canvas flaps rolled up just enough to let in a strip of light and a ribbon of passing landscape. Sachiko pressed her face to the gap and watched America scroll past like a film she had never been meant to see. The land was enormous. That was the first thing. In Tokyo, the sky was a narrow strip between buildings. In Okinawa, it was a ceiling of smoke. Here, the sky went on forever blue and deep and open in a way that made her chest ache. The fields were golden, stretching to horizons so distant they seemed to curve with the earth itself. Cattle stood in clusters, dark shapes against pale grass, chewing slowly, unbothered by history. They passed gas stations with bright red Coca-Cola signs, and children riding bicycles near white picket fences, and farmhouses with porches wide enough to hold entire families. Everything was too large, too bright, too alive. Sachiko felt exposed beneath that sky, as though every wound she carried was suddenly visible from a great distance. The truck slowed. The road turned to dirt. Dust rose around them like a curtain. And then they stopped. Through the gap in the canvas, Sachiko saw a wooden gate wide open framed by fence posts wrapped in barbed wire that stretched in both directions until it vanished into the landscape. Beyond the gate, a ranch spread out under the late afternoon sun, a main house of wood and stone with a broad porch, a large barn that had been cleaned and converted, its doors freshly oiled, a mess hall beside a kitchen building, and beyond all of it, pasture land rolling toward the horizon, dotted with cattle and mesquite trees in the long shadows of a Texas evening. Standing on the porch was a man, tall, lean, skin burned dark by decades of sun, gray eyes under the brim of a wide hat, hands large and calloused hanging at his sides with a stillness that seemed deliberate, as though he were holding himself in place by force of will. This was Thomas McAllister, 58 years old, owner of this ranch. Veteran of the First World War, where he had fought at Belleau Wood in 1918 and learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward while your legs begged you to run. He had agreed to let the military use part of his ranch as a temporary holding facility for this group of Japanese women, while the main processing camps dealt with overflow. He had agreed because a man in his position did not refuse when his country asked. But agreement and welcome were not the same thing. Sachiko studied him as she stepped down from the truck. She saw the rigid posture, the controlled breathing, the jaw set so tight the muscle pulsed visibly beneath his ear. She saw something else too, something behind those gray eyes. Not cruelty, not contempt, something heavier, something he was working very hard to keep locked behind his face. He was hiding something. She was certain of it. Beside him stood a woman. Shorter, rounder, with red-rimmed eyes and lips pressed into a line so thin they nearly disappeared. Martha McAllister, 55 years old. She gripped her apron with both hands, twisting the fabric between her fingers the way a person wrings out a cloth. On the kitchen table behind her, visible through the window, sat a framed photograph of a young man in uniform, smiling the wide, careless smile of someone who believed he would live forever. Private First Class Jimmy McAllister. Their grandson, 20 years old, killed at Okinawa in May of 1945. 4 months ago, the same battle where these women had been found. Martha had not wanted them here. She had told Tom so. She had said it was wrong having the enemy sleep under the same sky as Jimmy's memory. Tom had listened, nodded, and said nothing, which was his way of saying the decision was already made. Captain Raymond Foster stood in the yard in his pressed uniform, reading from a clipboard through a Nisei interpreter, a Japanese-American soldier who served as translator. He explained the arrangement: temporary housing, medical care, humane treatment according to the standards of the Geneva Convention. repatriation to Japan within 3 to 6 months once paperwork was processed. The words floated through the warm air and landed on the women like leaves falling on still water. They heard. They did not believe. Belief had been beaten out of them long before the war ended. Noriko stood at the back of the group, spine straight, chin lifted, staring through Captain Foster as though he were made of glass. Sachiko translated the words silently in her mind and thought, "They say we will be treated well." But Japanese ships said the same thing once. The next morning the order came. 2 words spoken in English by a young soldier with sunburned cheeks and a clipboard that looked too large for his hands. "Line up." The words did not need translation. Every woman understood. They had been waiting for this moment since they boarded the ship. This was when it would begin. The stripping, the inspection, the humiliation, everything they had been warned about, everything the propaganda had promised, everything their worst nightmares had rehearsed. They stepped into the yard and formed a line in the morning sun. The dust was pale and dry beneath their bare feet. The sky was already bright, the air already warm with the promise of a scorching day. Sachiko stood near the front, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. Noriko stood rigid, chin-raised, eyes fixed on the horizon, ready to receive execution with the dignity of a samurai's daughter. Fumiko trembled violently. Her eyes squeezed shut, her fists clenched at her sides. Haruko gripped the stub of a pencil in her pocket like it was the last solid thing in the world. Then Billy Crawford walked out of the barn carrying a wooden crate. He was 19 years old from a small farm outside Abilene, with red cheeks and a neck that burned instead of tanning, and hands that were more familiar with fence posts than firearms. He had enlisted too late to see combat, and everything about this assignment confused him. He set the crate down at the head of the line and opened it. Inside were dresses, cotton, folded neatly, white with small blue flowers. Beside them, bars of soap wrapped in paper, combs, thin towels. Billy picked up the first dress and held it out towards Sachiko. His face was red. His hand shook slightly. He had never handed a dress to a woman before, certainly not a woman who looked at him with the hollow eyes of someone expecting a blow. "Ma'am," he said. The silence that followed was so complete that Sachiko could hear the wind moving through the grass beyond the fence. She looked at the dress. Clean cotton, fresh soap smell. The fabric was soft, printed with tiny flowers that someone in a factory somewhere had thought were cheerful. It was the cleanest thing she had touched in over 2 years. It was not a uniform. It was not a prisoner's garment. It was the kind of dress an ordinary woman might wear on an ordinary morning to do ordinary things. And ordinary had become the most luxurious word in Sachiko's vocabulary. Her hand reached out, pulled back, reached out again. Then she took it, and the weight of it surprised her. Not the physical weight, the weight of what it meant. Someone had chosen this dress. Someone had folded it. Someone had placed it in a crate and carried it across a dusty yard and held it out to her and said, "Ma'am," a word that meant she was not a number, not a body, not a tool, but a person deserving of a small and ordinary courtesy. Down the line, Billy moved with quiet persistence. Kazuko accepted her bundle with a calm nod, as though she had expected this. Haruko took the soap, raised it to her nose, inhaled deeply, and began to cry, silent tears running down her cheeks, while she clutched the bar like it was something alive. Billy set a bundle on the ground beside Fumiko's feet, because the girl would not open her eyes or extend her hand, and he walked on without pressing. Then he reached Noriko. He held out the dress. Noriko did not move. Her eyes burned. Billy held it closer. Noriko turned her face away. "I do not accept gifts from the enemy," she said in Japanese, her voice flat and hard. Kazuko stepped forward and translated softly. "She says no. Give her time." Billy nodded, placed the bundle on the ground beside Noriko's feet, and moved on. The dress lay in the Texas dust. Noriko looked down at it the way a person looks at a snake. Inside the kitchen behind the window, Martha McAllister watched. She saw the dresses being handed out. She saw the girl who refused. She saw the tears, the trembling hands, the stunned faces. And behind her on the table, Jimmy's photograph smiled his eternal smile. Martha gripped the edge of the counter until her knuckles turned white. Something was fighting inside her chest. The instinct to nurture bred into the bones of every Texas woman who had ever fed a stranger at her table warred against the grief of a grandmother who had lost her boy to the very people now standing in her yard. She closed her eyes, The tears did not come. She had already cried them all, but the war inside her was far from over. That night the women lay on their cots in the converted barn, surrounded by the smell of hay and old leather and the faint sweet scent of horse sweat that no amount of cleaning could fully remove. Moonlight slipped through the mace in the wooden walls, drawing thin silver lines across the floor. Crickets sang outside. Somewhere far away a cow lowed long and slow, and the sound drifted across the fields like a lullaby sung in a language no one in that barn had ever heard. Sachiko lay on her back staring at the ceiling beams and felt her body sink into the mattress. It was thin. It was lumpy. It was the most comfortable surface she had touched in 2 years. She did not know whether to relax or to be terrified of the relaxation. She opened her diary and wrote by the faint light from the hallway. I do not know what to do with this quiet. It is louder than any bomb. Around 9 o'clock, the barn door opened. Not Billy, not a soldier. Martha McAllister stepped inside carrying a large pot and a stack of tin bowls. She said nothing. She walked to the wooden table in the center of the room, set the pot down, and began to ladle. The smell unfurled into the room like a living thing. Beef stew, potatoes, onions, carrots, salt. The warmth of it filled the air and reached into every corner and every chest and every memory of every meal these women had ever lost. Martha filled each bowl and placed them on the table. Then she stepped back. Her face was still hard, her eyes still red, her mouth still set in that thin, unforgiving line. But she had cooked for them. The contradiction between her expression and her action made the moment more powerful than any smile could have. This was not a woman offering love. This was a woman offering duty, and duty to a generation that understood sacrifice was sometimes worth more than love. Sachiko ate. The first spoonful hit her tongue, and she tasted salt, a flavor she had almost forgotten. Then potatoes soft and warm dissolving against the roof of her mouth. Then beef rich and heavy filling a hollow that had been empty so long she had forgotten it existed. She ate slowly. She cried while she ate. She felt ashamed of both. Ashamed of crying in front of the enemy. Ashamed that the enemy's food was the best thing she had tasted in 2 years. She wrote in her diary that night, "This kindness is unbearable. It weighs more than cruelty. Because cruelty gives me permission to hate them. Kindness does not." Fumiko did not eat with the group. But later, when the barn was dark and everyone had settled into their cots, Sachiko opened her eyes and saw the girl sitting up in the shadows lifting a bowl to her lips, with both hands drinking the cold broth in the dark where no one could see. Sachiko closed her eyes again and said nothing. The girl was eating. That was enough. That was everything. Martha collected the empty pot and walked to the door. She paused there, her back to the room, and Sachiko saw her shoulders tremble once. Then she stepped into the night. Tom was waiting on the porch. "You all right?" he asked. Martha did not answer. She walked straight to the bedroom and closed the door. Tom stood alone on the porch, looking at the barn where a dim oil lamp still flickered, and his hand moved unconsciously to the breast pocket of his shirt, where he kept a letter. The last letter Jimmy had written from Okinawa 3 weeks before he died. The final line read, "Grandpa, you were right. War is not about who is stronger. War is about who is still human after everything is over." Tom read that line most nights. He read it the way a man reads a prayer. Not because he fully believed it, but because he needed to. Because without that line, the rage inside him had nowhere to go except outward, and Tom McAllister had spent his whole life keeping dangerous things contained. 2 days later, Dr. Henry Walsh arrived from Camp Huntsville to conduct medical examinations. Walsh was 52, a military physician who had served in the Pacific Theater and participated in the liberation of Okinawa. He was one of the first American doctors to formally document the comfort women system, writing a report that the War Department promptly filed away because Washington had no appetite for complicated moral questions when there were millions of soldiers to bring home. Walsh examined each woman in the temporary clinic beside the barn. When he reached Sachiko, he checked her eyes, ears, lungs, and pulse. Then he paused. His gaze had fallen on her wrists. 2 parallel scars, faded but unmistakable. He did not ask about them. He simply made a note in her file. But then he said quietly, "You were a medical student. It was not a question." Sachiko stiffened. "How do you know?" Walsh pointed at her hand. "The way you hold your wrist when I check your pulse." You were counting. She had been counting her own heartbeats while he took her pulse. An old habit from the lecture hall, a reflex she did not know she still had. For the first time since she left Tokyo Women's Medical University, someone had seen what she used to be. Not a comfort girl, not a number, a medical student with steady hands and a mind built for healing. Walsh examined Fumiko last. When he finished, his face was grave. He stepped outside and spoke privately with Captain Foster. The girl's condition was severe. Acute psychological trauma compounded by malnutrition and dehydration. She needed specialized care-time food in the presence of someone who did not threaten her. That, Walsh said, was all medicine could offer at this point. Foster nodded slowly. Then he handed Walsh a telegram that had arrived that morning. Walsh read it. His expression changed. He folded the paper, slipped it into his pocket, and said, "We have a problem. Washington is sending someone down. Sergeant Dale Hendricks. He wants to review the legal status of these women." Foster frowned. Hendricks. The one who lost both sons in the Pacific. Walsh nodded. He wants to reclassify them. He argues they are not prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention, that they are civilian detainees with no legal right to military protection or medical care. Foster stared. What does that mean? Walsh looked toward the barn where the women were resting. It means that if Hendricks proves his case, these women lose everything. No Geneva protections, no medical treatment. Immediate deportation back to a country that considers them a national disgrace. And in the conditions some of them are in, he did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. If stories like this matter to you, hit subscribe. Because the story of these women deserves to be told. And what happens next will test everything these people believe about mercy duty and what it means to be human after the war is over. Sergeant Dale Hendricks arrived on a Tuesday morning, 10 days after the women first set foot on the McAllister Ranch. The sky was clear and hard and blue, the kind of Texas sky that offers no shade and no mercy, and the dust his Jeep kicked up hung in the air long after the engine died. He stepped out with the precision of a man who measured every movement. His uniform was pressed to perfection, creases sharp enough to cut paper boots polished to a mirror shine despite the dirt road he had just traveled. His face was narrow, clean-shaven, with cheekbones that cast small shadows beneath his eyes, and a mouth set in a permanent line that was not quite a frown, but had forgotten how to be anything else. He carried a leather briefcase in one hand and nothing else. He did not need anything else. His weapons were inside that briefcase. They were made of paper. Tom met him at the gate. The two men shook hands. Hendricks had a firm grip, dry and brief, the handshake of a man who had no interest in pleasantries. "Thank you for your hospitality, Mr. McAllister," he said. "I will try to keep my visit short." His voice was quiet, controlled, the kind of voice that never needed to be raised because it carried the authority of absolute certainty. Tom nodded and led him inside. Martha had set coffee and cornbread on the kitchen table, the same table where Jimmy's photograph still sat in his frame, and Hendricks glanced at the photo as he sat down but said nothing about it. He opened his briefcase and began laying out files with the careful order of a man building a case he intended to win. But before we talk about what Hendricks did during that week, you need to understand the world he walked into. Because in the 10 days before his arrival, something had begun to change on the McAllister Ranch. Something quiet and fragile and entirely unexpected. The mornings had developed a rhythm. Martha woke before dawn every day the way she had for 30 years. And by the time the first light touched the barn roof, the kitchen was already alive with sound and smell. The crack of eggs against the rim of a cast-iron skillet. The slow sizzle of bacon, real American bacon thick, cut cured with salt and brown sugar, popping and curling in its own fat, until the edges turned dark and crisp and the smell drifted out through the screen door and across the yard and into the barn where 23 women lay on their cots and breathed it in before they even opened their eyes. That smell, it did things to people. For the cowboys who worked the ranch, it was Tuesday. For the women in the barn, it was a resurrection. They had eaten rice and rainwater and scraps of dried fish for years. They had chewed bark when there was nothing else. They had learned to sleep through hunger the way a person learns to sleep through noise, not because the hunger stopped, but because the body simply gave up complaining. And now every morning the air filled with bacon and coffee and the faint sweetness of cornbread baking in the oven, and their bodies remembered what it was to want something other than survival. Sachiko ate slowly every morning, sitting at the long table in the mess hall, with the other women chewing each bite with deliberate attention. She had lost the habit of tasting food. She was relearning it. The bacon was salty and smoky, and the fat melted against her tongue, and for a few seconds each morning while that flavor spread through her mouth, she was not a comfort girl, not a prisoner, not a woman carrying scars on her wrists and nightmares in her sleep. She was just a person eating breakfast. The simplicity of it brought her closer to tears than any cruelty ever had. Martha served the meals without warmth but also without hostility. She filled plates. She refilled coffee. She wiped the counter. She did not sit with the women or speak to them beyond the necessary words. But Sachiko noticed things. She noticed that Martha always placed an extra strip of bacon on Fumiko's plate when the girl was not looking. She noticed that Martha had begun cutting the cornbread into smaller pieces, after observing that several women had difficulty chewing. She noticed that when Haruko once left half her meal untouched because her stomach cramped from eating too much too fast, Martha quietly set a cup of warm broth beside her and walked away without comment. These were not gestures of affection, they were gestures of attention. And attention from a woman who had every reason to look away was its own kind of courage. In the afternoons, the women helped with ranch chores, not because they were ordered to, but because idleness created space for the mind to wander into dark places and work kept the darkness at a distance. Kazuko washed clothes in the wooden tubs beside the wash house, her hands moving through soapy water, with the steady rhythm of someone who understood that repetition was a form of meditation. Haruko gathered eggs from the chicken coop, a task that terrified and delighted her in equal measure, because the hens were unpredictable and loud, and entirely unlike anything she had encountered in Yokohama. One afternoon, Billy Crawford crouched beside her and showed her how to reach beneath a hen without startling it, moving his hands slowly, speaking softly, treating the bird with the same gentle patience he would show a frightened horse. When Haruko tried, the egg wobbled in her palm and nearly fell. She gasped. Billy caught it before it hit the ground and handed it back with a crooked grin. And then it happened. Haruko laughed. A small sound, barely more than a breath, but it escaped her before she could stop it and hung in the warm air like something holy. She covered her mouth immediately, eyes wide, as though she had committed a crime. Billy just tipped his hat and went back to work. But that laugh, it was the first one heard in that barn since the women arrived, and it would not be the last. Sachiko spent her afternoons in the makeshift clinic with Dr. Walsh, organizing supplies, learning the English names of medicines, reawakening the medical knowledge that had been buried beneath years of degradation. Walsh taught her patiently. He showed her how to read an American thermometer, how to prepare a sulfa powder dressing, how to take blood pressure with the inflatable cuff and stethoscope that she had only seen in textbooks. Her hands remembered. They steadied when she held instruments. They moved with the precision of someone trained to heal. And Walsh, watching her work, said one afternoon, "You are still a doctor, Sachiko. Whatever they took from you, they did not take that." She did not respond. But that night she wrote in her diary, "He called me a doctor today. I have not been called that since 1943. I did not know a word could weigh so much." In the evenings, Billy played his harmonica on the fence rail outside the barn. The sound drifted through the slats and settled over the women like a second blanket. It was not a marching song, not a victory tune, just a slow, wandering melody that moved like water over stones. One evening, Haruko stood in the doorway listening, and Billy offered her the harmonica. She blew a single note, thin and wobbly, and the sound made them both smile. This was not romance. This was two 19-year-olds sharing a moment of peace in a world that had given them very little of it. Billy did not know what Haruko had endured. Haruko did not know that Billy had a brother who came home from the Pacific with one arm and nightmares that woke the whole house. They did not need to know. The harmonica was enough. But beneath this fragile peace, cracks were spreading. Noriko still refused to wear the cotton dress. She wore her torn Japanese military uniform like a flag of defiance. She ate alone, sitting apart from the group, her back to the mess hall wall, chewing mechanically without tasting. And she had begun speaking to the others in private. Sachiko did not hear the words at first. She only noticed the pattern. Noriko would sit beside one woman during washing, another during the walk back from the chicken coop, a third in the quiet hour before sleep. She spoke softly, urgently, with the intensity of someone delivering a sermon. And the women she spoke to began to change. Their eyes grew distant. Their smiles, newly learned, began to fade. On the eighth night, Sachiko woke to find Noriko standing in the center of the barn, surrounded by 7 women sitting on the edges of their cots. The oil lamp cast long shadows across their faces. Noriko's voice was low but sharp, each word landing like a stone dropped into still water. "The war is over, but our shame is not," Noriko said. "We were captured alive. We eat the enemy's food. We laugh at their jokes. We wash their clothes. Do you not see what we have become? We are comfort women again. The only difference is that this time we volunteered." On Saipan, 1,000 women chose death over this. They jumped from the cliffs into the sea rather than let the Americans touch them. They are heroes. And what are we? Silence. 2 women were crying, one was nodding. The air in the barn felt suddenly too thick to breathe. Sachiko stepped out of the shadows. She did not raise her voice. She did not argue. She said, "Noriko, I understand. I understand why you feel this way. Look at my wrists." She held them out, the twin scars pale in the lamplight. "I tried. I failed. And every day since then I have asked myself whether that failure was cowardice or courage. I still do not have the answer. But I know one thing. If you die here on American soil in a barn in Texas, who will know? Who will remember your name? No one. You will be buried in foreign dirt and forgotten. Your father died fighting. He died with witnesses, with comrades, with a story that people can tell. If you die here, there will be no story. Only silence. You want honor, then live. Live and tell the world what was done to us. Death is silence, Noriko. Only the living have a voice." Noriko stared at Sachiko for a long time. Her jaw trembled. Her hands shook at her sides. Then something broke at her, not loudly, not dramatically, but like a wall crumbling inward, and she sat down on the edge of her cot and wept. It was the first time anyone had seen Noriko cry since they left Japan. The sound of it filled the barn, ragged and raw and deeply human, and no one moved to comfort her because the crying itself was the comfort. It was the sound of a woman putting down something she had been carrying far too long. Sachiko sat beside her. She stayed the entire night. When morning came, Noriko reached beneath her cot and pulled out a shard of broken mirror that she had been hiding. She handed it to Sachiko without a word. Sachiko took it and understood. The mirror shard had been a weapon. Now it was just glass. Noriko did not say, "I will live." She said only, "I will wait." In the corner, unseen by anyone, Fumiko lay with her eyes open. She had watched the entire exchange. And in the darkness, her lips moved. A single word spoken so softly it was barely louder than a breath. Hiroshima. One word. The first word she had spoken in months. Sachiko turned, eyes wide. Fumiko closed her eyes and rolled toward the wall. But she had spoken. Something inside that shattered girl was beginning slowly and painfully to reassemble. Then Hendricks came and everything changed. He spent his first 3 days reviewing files. Every document, every form, every medical record, every transportation order. He sat in the small office Captain Foster had cleared for him and read with the meticulous attention of a man who believed that truth lived in paperwork, and that paperwork did not lie. He interviewed each woman through the Nisei interpreter, asking questions that were precise and clinical and devastating in their simplicity. What was your rank? Did you take an oath of service? Were you issued a weapon? Did you wear an insignia? Each answer of no was another brick in the wall he was building. These women were not soldiers. They were not members of the armed forces. They did not meet the criteria of Article 1 of the Geneva Convention of 1929, which defined prisoners of war as members of the armed forces of a belligerent nation. If they were not prisoners of war, they were not entitled to the protections that came with that status. No guaranteed medical care, no requirement for humane housing, no legal barrier to immediate deportation. When Sachiko sat across from him in the interview room, she felt the temperature drop. Hendricks looked at her the way a surgeon looks at an X-ray, seeing only the relevant data, filtering out everything human. "Miss Tanaka," he said, "you stated you were a medical student before the war. You were then conscripted into military service as a field nurse. Is that correct?" "Yes," Sachiko said through the interpreter. Hendricks made a note. "Conscripted, not volunteered, not a member of the armed forces by choice." He looked up. "Were you ever issued a rank number, a weapon number, an oath of service to the Emperor?" Sachiko paused. Every Japanese citizen had pledged loyalty to the emperor. It was taught in schools, recited at assemblies, woven into the fabric of daily life. But that was not a military oath. No, she said carefully. Not a military oath. Hendricks wrote, no rank, no weapon, no military oath, civilian conscript. He closed the file and looked at her with those gray eyes that held nothing personal. No malice, no compassion. Only the cold certainty of a man who believed he was doing the right thing. Thank you, Miss Tanaka. Sachiko left the room and found her hands trembling. She understood now what Hendricks was doing. He was not trying to punish them. He was trying to reclassify them. And reclassification in the bureaucratic machinery of a nation processing millions of war refugees was a death sentence wrapped in legal language. But Hendricks was not a monster. That was what made him dangerous. A monster could be hated. Hendricks could only be understood. Late one night after everyone had retired, Tom walked past the mess hall and saw light under the door. He opened it quietly. Hendricks sat alone at the long table, his files spread before him, but he was not reading. He was looking at two small photographs propped against a tin coffee cup. Two young men in uniform. Robert, 23, killed at Iwo Jima. Alan, 20, killed at Okinawa. The photographs were creased from handling the edges worn soft. Hendricks stared at them with an expression Tom recognized because he had seen it in his own mirror. It was the face of a man who had outlived the people he was supposed to protect. Tom stood in the doorway for a longer moment. Hendricks did not notice him. Then Tom stepped back and closed the door without a sound. He walked out onto the porch and stood in the darkness, and for the first time since Hendricks arrived, Tom felt something other than suspicion toward the man. He felt recognition. They were the same. Two old men hollowed out by the war trying to fill the emptiness with purpose. The only difference was the shape of the purpose. Tom had chosen mercy. Hendricks had chosen order. And both of them, Tom realized with a chill, were running from the same grief. Then Hendricks dropped his bomb. On the fifth day, he requested a private meeting with Tom. They sat on the porch, coffee going cold between them, and Hendricks opened a folder marked with Japanese characters and American military stamps. Inside were documents recovered from captured Japanese military records, unit rosters, and assignment logs from the 32nd Army of the Imperial Japanese Army, the unit that had defended Okinawa. Mr. McAllister, Hendricks said, his voice level and precise. I have reviewed the service records of the women housed on your property. Several of them, including Miss Tanaka, were assigned to support units attached to the 32nd Army. He paused. The 32nd Army was responsible for the defense of the Shuri Line and the surrounding positions. Your grandson, Private First Class James McAllister, was killed during the American assault on those positions on May 19, 1945. Tom's coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth. Hendricks continued. I am not suggesting that any of these women personally harmed your grandson. They were support personnel, not combat troops. But they served the unit that fought and killed American soldiers in that sector, including your grandson. I thought you should know. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full. Full of things Tom could not say, could not feel, could not process while sitting 3 feet from another human being. He set his coffee cup down with exaggerated care as though it were made of glass. He looked at Hendricks. He looked past Hendricks at the barn at the door behind which Sachiko and the others were sleeping. Then he stood, put on his hat, and walked out into the pasture without a word. He did not come back until dark. What followed were the 3 worst days of Tom McAllister's life, and he had lived through Bellow Wood. He stopped coming to the mess hall. He stopped checking the fences. He sat alone in the horse barn, the real one, the one that still held saddles and bridles and the smell of animals, and he pretended to repair tack that did not need repairing. Martha knew something was wrong. She asked twice. He said nothing twice. Billy Crawford noticed the change. Mr. McAllister has not been out in days, he told Walsh. Something is off. On the 13th night, well past midnight, Sachiko woke to the sound of boots on packed earth. She crept to the wall and pressed her eye to a gap between the boards. Tom McAllister stood in the yard directly outside the door of the women's quarters. He held a bottle of whiskey nearly empty. His hat was off. His hair was wild. His face lit by the moon wore an expression she had never seen on him before. Hatred. Not the focused hatred of an enemy, but the sprawling, uncontrollable hatred of a man who has been ambushed by his own grief. He stared at the barn door, and Sachiko could see the muscles in his jaw working, could see his free hand opening and closing at his side, and she understood with terrible clarity that this man was standing at the edge of something from which there might be no return. Tom raised the whiskey bottle and drank the last of it. He wiped his mouth with his sleeve. Then he reached into his breast pocket and pulled out the letter. Jimmy's letter. His hands shook so badly he nearly dropped it. He unfolded it and read by moonlight, his lips moving silently, and Sachiko could not hear the words, but she could see their effect. His face crumpled. His shoulders fell. The bottle slipped from his hand and landed on its side in the dust. And Tom McAllister, 58 years old veteran of 2 wars, owner of 600 acres of Texas cattle land, slid down the wall of the barn and sat on the ground and cried. Not loudly, not the way a young man cries with Boston Haba and the drama of fresh grief. This was the crying of an old man, quiet and devastating, like water seeping through a crack in a dam. His body shook. His breath came in short, broken pulls. He pressed the letter to his chest and rocked slightly forward and back, and the moon watched him without comment. Sachiko did not move. She did not breathe. She stayed at the wall and watched and felt something shift inside her own chest, something she had not expected. Compassion for the enemy. For the man who owned this land and fed them and clothed them and was now breaking apart in the dust because the war had taken his grandson and delivered the people connected to that death into his care. She wrote in her diary later, "I watched the enemy cry tonight, and I understood that he is suffering too. We are on opposite sides of the war, but the war has only one side, the side of those who lost." In the morning, Tom appeared at the mess hall. His face was swollen, his eyes were red, but he sat at the table and drank his coffee, and when Sachiko entered, he looked at her and gave a single nod. It was not a smile. It was not forgiveness. It was acknowledgement. I am still here. I am still choosing to do what is right, even though I hate it. Hendricks watched from across the room. He saw the nod. He noted it. He wrote something in his file. He was still building his case. 5 days later, on a hot afternoon with the sun directly overhead and the air shimmering above the dirt road, Billy Crawford was mending a fence in the far pasture when a western diamondback rattlesnake struck his left calf. The sound reached the main buildings as a shout, sharp and raw, followed by the heavy fall of a body hitting dry ground. A cowboy came running. Snake bite. The boy is down. They carried Billy to the clinic on a plank of wood. His leg was already swelling, the skin around the twin puncture marks turning an angry red that spread outward like ink on wet paper. His face was gray. His breathing was rapid and shallow. Dr. Walsh was at Camp Huntsville, 4 hours away by road. The nearest hospital was in San Angelo, 45 minutes at least. Rattlesnake venom could kill in hours, but anaphylactic shock could kill in minutes, and Billy's breathing was getting worse. Tom stood over the boy, his face white. The cowboys stood behind him, helpless, shifting their weight from boot to boot. No one knew what to do beyond tying a strip of cloth above the bite, which they had already done too tightly. Then Sachiko came through the door. She did not ask permission. She looked at the wound, checked. Billy's pulse, checked his pupils. Her hands moved with the calm precision of training that had been buried but never lost. She turned to the medicine shelf, the same shelf she had organized with Walsh the previous week, and she knew exactly where everything was. She pulled morphine for the pain, sulfa powder for infection. She replaced the crude tourniquet with a proper pressure bandage, tight enough to slow the venom's spread, but not so tight it would cut off circulation entirely. She spoke through Kazuko, who translated in real time, "Keep his leg below his heart. Do not cut the wound. Do not try to suck out the venom. He needs anti-venom at the hospital, but I can keep him stable until he gets there." Her voice was steady. Her hands did not shake. She was not Sachiko, the comfort girl. She was not number 47. She was Sachiko, the medical student, the woman who had once dreamed of surgery, whose hands had been trained to save lives before the war taught them to endure destruction. Tom stood in the corner and watched a Japanese woman save the life of one of his people, a woman from the very unit connected to the death of his grandson. The world tilted beneath him. Every wall he had built inside his mind, every clean division between enemy and ally, between hatred and compassion, between them and us, cracked and shifted and refused to stay in place. Billy was loaded into a truck and driven to San Angelo. He survived. When Walsh returned and reviewed Sachiko's treatment, he said, "You did everything correctly. Not a single error." Sachiko did not smile. She said, I am a doctor. That is my job. She said it in English, without the interpreter. It was the first time she had claimed that identity aloud in nearly 3 years. Hendricks was there. He watched the entire emergency. He observed Sachiko's competence. He heard Walsh's assessment. And later that evening, alone in his makeshift office, he opened Sachiko's file and began to write. He wrote Tanaka Sachiko, demonstrated medical competency. He stared at the word competency for a long time. Then he crossed it out and wrote expertise. A small change. One word replacing another. But it was the first crack in the wall of Dale Hendricks, and cracks once started do not stop on their own. The snakebite changed things inside the group as well. Most of the women looked at Sachiko differently now. She had saved an American life. She had proven that she was more than what had been done to her. If Sachiko was still a doctor after everything, then maybe they were still something too. Maybe the war had not erased them completely. Maybe there was still something underneath the damage worth recovering. But Noriko saw it differently. She found Sachiko that evening near the water trough, and her voice was low and trembling with fury. You saved one of them. Have you forgotten what they did to our country? What they did to us? You are a traitor. Sachiko, you are worse than a comfort woman. At least we had no choice. You chose this. Sachiko looked at Noriko for a long time before answering. Noriko, he is 19 years old. He plays harmonica on the fence at night. He catches eggs so they do not break. He is not the war. He is a boy. And a doctor does not ask whose side the patient is on before deciding whether to save a life. Noriko turned away. But the anger in her eyes was not just anger. It was terror. Because if the Americans could be kind, and if a Japanese woman could save an American, then the entire structure of belief that Noriko had built her survival on was collapsing. And if that structure collapsed, then her father's death became simply a death. Not a sacrifice, not an act of honor, just a man dying in cold water for nothing. That night, Kazuko shook Sachiko awake. Her face was pale. Noriko has convinced 3 of the girls, she whispered. They found another piece of broken glass. They are planning to go to the far field tonight. Sachiko's blood went cold. She rose without a sound. She found Noriko sitting on a cot at the back of the barn, surrounded by 3 young women whose faces were blank with resignation. One held a shard of glass wrapped in cloth. The oil lamp flickered. Shadows moved across the walls like ghosts. Sachiko knelt in front of Noriko. She did not shout. She did not beg. She spoke in the voice she once used with patience, calm and clear and honest. Noriko, I am not going to tell you that dying is wrong. I am not going to tell you that your father would want you to live. I do not know what your father would want. But I know this. You want to die for honor. You want your death to mean something. But if you die here tonight in a field in Texas, no one will know. No one will write your name. No one will tell your story. You will be a number in a file that an American sergeant puts into a drawer. Is that the honor you want? Is that what your father died for? So that his daughter could become a footnote. Noriko's breathing was ragged. Her hands gripped the edge of the cot. Sachiko continued. On Saipan, those women jumped because they believed they had no future. But you have a future, Noriko. A terrible, confusing, painful future, but a future. And in that future, you can speak. You can tell people what was done to us. You can make sure the world remembers. The dead cannot do that. Only the living can. Death is the end of the story. I am asking you to stay for the next chapter. The silence lasted a long time. Then Noriko's face broke. Not all at once, not like glass shattering, but slowly like ice melting in spring, reluctant and inevitable. She cried. Deep gasping sobs that shook her entire body and filled the barn with the sound of a woman releasing something she had carried since the day her father's ship went down in Leyte Gulf. The 3 girls cried with her. Sachiko held Noriko's hands and said nothing because there was nothing to say. The crying was enough. When it was over, Noriko reached under her pillow and pulled out the shard of glass. She placed it in Sachiko's palm. She did not say, I will live. She said only, I will wait. It was not a promise. It was a truce with herself. And for now, it was enough. In the far corner of the barn, invisible in the dark, Fumiko Nakamura lay with her eyes open. She had watched everything. She had heard every word. And in the silence that followed Noriko's surrender, Fumiko's lips moved. One word. whispered so faintly it was almost indistinguishable from breathing. Hiroshima. Sachiko turned. Their eyes met across the dark room. Fumiko closed her eyes and turned to the wall. But she had spoken. After months of silence, after whatever unspeakable thing had sealed her voice shut, she had opened her mouth and let a single word escape. It was not a sentence. It was not a story. It was a crack in a dam. And Sachiko, who understood cracks better than most, knew that what comes after a crack is either collapse or healing, and that both begin the same way. She wrote in her diary that night, Noriko gave me the glass. Fumiko said a word. I do not know if we are breaking or mending. Maybe they are the same thing. If you want to know what happens when Hendrix forces a hearing that will decide the fate of these women, and what Sachiko says in that room that changes everything, hit like and share this video. Because this story deserves to be heard. And the hardest part is still to come. The hearing took place on a Wednesday morning in the mess hall. The long tables had been pushed against the walls, and the benches arranged in rows like pews in a church. Though what was about to happen felt less like worship and more like a trial. Captain Raymond Foster sat at a table at the front of the room, his back to the window, a stack of files before him, and a pen in his hand. He had not slept well. The circles under his eyes were dark enough to be visible from across the room. He was a man who had spent his career following procedure, and procedure had not prepared him for this. Hendricks sat to Foster's left, his briefcase open to his documents arranged in precise stacks. He wore a fresh uniform. His boots were polished. His face held the composed certainty of a man who had rehearsed every argument and anticipated every objection. He did not look nervous because nervousness required doubt, and Dale Hendricks had buried his doubt alongside his two sons. To Foster's right sat Tom McAllister and Dr. Henry Walsh. Tom wore his best shirt, the one Martha ironed for church, and he sat with his hat on his knee and his hands flat on the table, fingers spread as though pressing them down was the only way to keep them from shaking. Walsh had driven through the night from Camp Huntsville, arriving just before dawn, with his medical files and the grim determination of a man who understood that bureaucracy could be more lethal than any weapon. Martha stood at the doorway of the mess hall. No one had invited her, and no one had told her to leave. She leaned against the frame with her arms crossed, watching with the sharp, quiet attention of a woman who had spent her life observing men make decisions that affected everyone and consulting no one. The women were not permitted inside. They waited in the barn, sitting on their cots in various states of anxiety, aware that their futures were being decided in a room they could not enter by people they could not understand. Only Sachiko had been called to testify, and she sat on a bench outside the mess hall door, her hands folded in her lap, her diary pressed between her palms like a prayer book. Foster opened the proceedings by reading the formal purpose of the hearing. The United States military needed to determine the legal classification of 23 Japanese women currently housed at the McAllister Ranch. Were they prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention of 1929? Were they civilian detainees? Were they enemy aliens? The classification would determine their rights, their treatment, and their immediate future. Hendricks spoke first. He stood and addressed Foster with the measured cadence of a man delivering a closing argument he had been composing for weeks. He laid out his case with the precision of a watchmaker assembling a mechanism. The Geneva Convention of 1929, Article 1, defined prisoners of war as members of the armed forces of a belligerent power. He presented evidence document by document that none of the 23 women met this definition. They had not enlisted voluntarily. They had not taken military oaths. They had not been issued weapons or ranks or insignia. They had been conscripted as support personnel and subsequently forced into the comfort system, a system that was itself a violation of international law, but that violation was committed by Japan, not by the United States. The United States, Hendricks argued, had no legal obligation to extend Geneva protections to individuals who were never legitimate combatants. His voice never rose. His hands never gestured. He spoke the way a scalpel cuts, with economy and purpose and no wasted motion. And the most devastating thing about his argument was that it was technically correct. The Geneva Convention of 1929 had been written with soldiers in mind. It had not anticipated comfort women. It had not anticipated a category of human suffering so specific and so grotesque that the law simply had no language for it. Therefore, Hendricks concluded these women should be reclassified as civilian detainees and transferred to the appropriate civilian processing facility for immediate repatriation. Continued housing at this military-adjacent facility represents an unauthorized use of resources and a departure from established protocol. He sat down, closed his folder, and placed his hands flat on the table in a posture that mirrored Tom's without either man noticing. Walsh spoke next. He stood slowly holding a sheaf of medical records, and his voice carried a roughness that came not from anger but from having seen too much. He described the physical condition of the women when they arrived: malnutrition, untreated infections, scars both visible and invisible. He described the psychological damage in clinical terms that somehow made it more terrible, not less: acute stress responses, dissociative episodes, selective mutism in the case of the youngest patient. He described Fumiko without using her name, calling her only the 16-year-old, and even Foster, who had spent the war behind a desk, flinched at the details. Walsh argued that regardless of legal classification, the United States military had a humanitarian obligation that superseded the technical boundaries of the Geneva Convention. These women were in American custody. Their physical and psychological conditions required ongoing medical supervision, immediate deportation to a nation in ruins, a nation where comfort women were regarded as objects of national shame, a nation that had no infrastructure to provide the care these women needed, would constitute a de facto death sentence for several of them. He cited precedent. American forces had extended humanitarian protection to displaced German civilians after the liberation of Europe, individuals who were also not prisoners of war. The principle was the same. When you hold someone's life in your hands, the law tells you what you must do. Conscience tells you what you should do. And sometimes conscience has to speak louder. Hendricks did not react. He sat motionless, his expression unchanged, his pen making small, precise notes on the margin of his folder. Then Tom stood. He had not prepared remarks. He had not written anything down. He gripped the edge of the table and spoke the way he did everything, slowly, directly, without ornament. "I need to say something," he began. His voice was steady but thin, like a wire pulled taut. "Sergeant Hendricks told me something last week that I have not been able to get out of my head. He told me that these women served a unit connected to the battle where my grandson Jimmy was killed. The 32nd Army, Okinawa. May of 1945. The room went silent. Foster's pen stopped moving. Walsh closed his eyes. Martha at the door pressed her hand flat against the frame. Tom continued. "When I heard that I wanted them gone, I will not lie to you about that. I stood outside their door at 3 in the morning with a bottle in my hand and hate in my heart, and I thought about walking in there and telling them to get out of my property and never come back. I thought about calling Sergeant Hendricks and telling him he was right, that these women do not deserve our protection, that my grandson's blood is on the same ground where they sleep." He paused. The room waited. "But my grandson wrote me a letter before he died, the last thing he ever wrote. And the last line of that letter said this: 'Grandpa, you were right. War is not about who is stronger. War is about who is still human after everything is over.'" Tom's voice cracked on the word human, a small fracture that he sealed immediately by clearing his throat and straightening his back. "If I send these women away, I am not the man Jimmy believed I was, and his death becomes meaningless. I will not let that happen. I will not let this war take one more thing from my family. Not my grandson's memory, not my humanity. I would rather lose this ranch than lose that." He sat down. Martha wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and looked at the ceiling. Walsh put his hand on Tom's shoulder and left it there. Foster turned to the door. "Miss Tanaka, please come in." Sachiko entered the mess hall the way a person enters a room where the air itself feels hostile. She was small in her cotton dress, her diary clutched against her chest, her hair pulled back, her face composed into the mask of clinical detachment that had kept her alive for 3 years. She stood before the table and looked at Foster, then at Hendricks, then at Tom. She took a breath. She spoke in English, slowly, carefully, each word chosen with the deliberate precision of someone building a bridge out of a language that was not her own. "Captain Foster, Sergeant Hendricks says we are not soldiers." She paused. "He is right, we are not soldiers. We were never soldiers. We were never given a choice. We were taken from our schools and our homes and our families, and we were used. Japan used us. We were tools, not people. Tools." She looked at Hendricks. He held her gaze. "Now you must decide what America does with tools that are broken. You can throw them away. That is what Sergeant Hendricks recommends. Send us back. Send us to a country that is ashamed of us, that will not speak our names, that will pretend we do not exist. Some of us will die, not from bombs, from silence, from being invisible again. Her voice did not waver. Her hands pressed against the diary were steady. Or you can do what no one has done for us before. You can treat us like people, not because the law says you must. The law does not say you must. Sergeant Hendricks has shown that very clearly. But because you choose to, because America is supposed to be different. That is what your soldiers told us when they found us. That is what the cowboys on this ranch have shown us every day, that America is different. She looked at Tom. Their eyes met and held. Mr. McAllister knows what unit I served. He knows I was connected to the battle where his grandson died. He has every reason to hate me, but he fed me. He gave me a dress. He let me sleep under his roof. And when one of his men was bitten by a snake and no doctor was here, I saved that man's life. Not because he was American, not because I owed him something, because I am a doctor, because that is what doctors do. We do not ask which side the patient is on. She turned back to Foster. Sergeant Hendricks lost his sons. I understand his pain. I carry pain too. All of us in that barn carry pain that we will never be able to put down. But pain is not a reason to turn away from mercy. Pain is the reason mercy matters. She stopped. The room was absolutely still. A fly buzzed against the window. Outside, a horse stamped its hoof. The world continued its ordinary business, while inside that mess hall, something extraordinary hung in the air, vibrating, waiting to be claimed or discarded. Foster looked at his files. He looked at Hendricks. He looked at Walsh. He looked at Tom. He picked up his pen, wrote something on the top sheet of the official form, and spoke. These women will remain at the McAllister Ranch under the humanitarian supervision of Dr. Walsh until formal repatriation processes are completed. This decision is based not on their legal classification as prisoners of war, which remains unresolved, but on the humanitarian obligations of the United States military toward individuals in its custody whose physical and psychological conditions require continued care. This facility will maintain current standards of treatment. That is my decision. It is final. Hendricks closed his folder. He stood. His face betrayed nothing. He picked up his briefcase and walked toward the door. But as he passed Sachiko, he stopped. He looked at her for a moment that stretched longer than it should have, a moment in which something shifted behind those gray eyes, something he would never name and never speak of again. You saved that boy's life, he said. Sachiko nodded. Hendricks' voice dropped to something barely above a whisper. My boys. Nobody saved them. Then he walked out of the mess hall across the yard to his Jeep. He placed his briefcase on the passenger seat. He started the engine, started the two-way, and before he pulled away, he sat for a moment with his hands on the wheel, staring at the barn where 23 women waited to hear their fate, and his jaw tightened and released and tightened again. And then he drove away down the long dirt road, trailing a cloud of red Texas dust that took a long time to settle. In the weeks that followed, the ranch changed. Not suddenly, the way a light switches on, but gradually the way dawn arrives so slowly you cannot point to the moment when darkness becomes light. Noriko put on the cotton dress. She did it without announcement, without ceremony. She simply appeared one morning in the mess hall, wearing the pale blue fabric with the small white flowers, and she sat at the table and ate breakfast with the others and said nothing about it. No one commented. No one needed to. The dress spoke for itself. It said, I am still here. I have not surrendered to the enemy. I have surrendered to being alive. Martha began teaching Kazuko how to make cornbread. The two women stood side by side at the kitchen counter, Martha's hands guiding Kazuko's through the motions of measuring flour and cracking eggs and testing the heat of the oven with an outstretched palm. When Kazuko added too much salt and the first batch came out dense and heavy, Martha laughed. It was a small laugh, tired and surprised, as though the sound had escaped from a room she thought she had locked. But it was real, and Kazuko laughed too. And the kitchen, for one moment, was not a place where enemies stood on opposite sides of a counter. It was just a kitchen where two women were learning to make bread. Fumiko began to speak. Not much. A few words each day offered carefully like coins placed one at a time on a table. She told Sachiko about Hiroshima, not all at once, in fragments. The morning of August 6th, the white light. The sound that was not a sound but an absence of sound, a silence so absolute it felt like the world had been erased. She had been on the outskirts of the city visiting a cousin. When she walked back, the city was gone. Her parents, her brother, her house, her school, her dog. Everything she had ever known had been replaced by ash and shadow and a silence that had crawled inside her and sealed her mouth shut. She told Sachiko these things in a voice that was hoarse from disuse, and Sachiko listened and wrote it all in her diary, not because she was collecting stories, but because bearing witness was the only medicine she had left to offer. Billy Crawford returned to the ranch on crutches, his leg bandaged, his face pale but grinning. When he saw Sachiko, he said, "Thank you, ma'am." And then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wooden comb, hand-carved, simple but smooth, the edges rounded with care. "My brother made it," he said, "before the war. He was always good with wood. He wanted you to have this. I wrote him about what you did." Sachiko took the comb. The wood was warm from Billy's pocket. It fit perfectly in her palm. She turned it over, feeling the grain, the small imperfections, the places where a knife had slipped and been corrected. It was not valuable. It was not beautiful. But it was made by someone's hands with care and intention, and that made it the most precious object she had held since leaving Tokyo. "Thank you," she said, and for the first time the words did not feel like submission. They felt like connection. Then the news arrived. Formal repatriation orders had been processed. The women would be transported to San Francisco and from there shipped to Yokohama within 2 weeks. They were going home. But home was a word that had lost its meaning. Home to what cities of rubble, families who might be dead, a society that would look at them with disgust and turn away. Comfort women in post-war Japan were not survivors. They were sources of shame. Many would return and find that no one was waiting for them. Many would spend the rest of their lives pretending those years had never happened, burying the truth so deep that it would take decades for the world to acknowledge what had been done to them. Sachiko sat on the steps of the barn that evening and watched the sun set over the Texas pasture land. The sky turned gold, then orange, then a deep bruised purple that bled into the horizon. The cattle moved slowly across the distant field, dark shapes against the fading light. Somewhere a mockingbird sang its borrowed songs. The air smelled of dust and grass and the faint sweetness of mesquite smoke from the kitchen where Martha was cooking the evening meal. She opened her diary and wrote, "They are sending us home, but I do not know where home is anymore. This barn smells like hay and leather. The sky here is bigger than any sky I have ever seen. A woman who lost her grandson to my people feeds me bacon every morning and does not smile but does not stop. A boy whose life I saved gave me a comb made by his brother. I came here as number 47. I will leave as Sachiko. That is what they gave me. Not food, not medicine, not dresses. They gave me back myself." The morning of departure arrived the way all endings arrive, too quickly and too slowly at the same time. The military trucks pulled into the yard just after sunrise, their engines idling in the cool morning air. The women packed what little they had: a dress, soap, a comb, letters some of them had written but never sent. Haruko had filled an entire notebook with observations and sketches. Kazuko carried a recipe for cornbread, written in Martha's handwriting on a scrap of brown paper. Noriko carried nothing visible, but she walked with her spine straight and her chin level, and there was something in her posture that had not been there before. Not pride exactly, endurance. The quiet strength of a woman who had chosen to live when dying would have been easier. They lined up one last time, but this time no one gave the order. They formed the line themselves instinctively, the way they might form a line at a temple or a school because it felt right, because standing together was something they had learned to do in this place. Their shoulders were straight, their eyes were open, their dresses sun-faded now and worn soft from washing still fit. That mattered more than it should have. Tom stood on the porch, Martha beside him, Billy on his crutches by the gate. A handful of cowboys stood along the fence, hats and hand boots, shuffling in the dirt. No one spoke. The silence was not uncomfortable. It was full of things that could not be translated into any language. Sachiko walked to Tom. She stood before him. Two people separated by war, by loss, by language, by an ocean, and 1,000 years of history standing 3 feet apart on a porch in Texas while the morning sun lit the dust around them like gold. Sachiko bowed. A deep, formal Japanese bow, the kind reserved for moments of profound respect. Then she straightened and looked Tom in the eye and said, "Mr. McAllister, you gave me back my name." Tom's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "Before here I was comfort girl, number 47. No name, no person, just number. Here you called me Sachiko. You called me ma'am. First time in 2 years someone used my name. You gave me back my name." Tom stood very still. His jaw worked. His eyes reddened. He was a Texas man, and Texas men did not cry in public, especially not twice, but his voice when it came was rough as gravel in a dry creek bed. "You take care of yourself, Sachiko." It was the first time he had spoken her name. Martha stepped forward. She walked past Sachiko, past the line of women, past the Cowboys, straight to Fumiko. The 16-year-old girl who had not spoken for months, who had eaten in the dark, who had carried Hiroshima inside her like a stone. Martha put her arms around Fumiko and held her. Not briefly, not politely. She held her the way a grandmother holds a child who has been lost and found again. Fumiko did not flinch. She did not pull away. She stood in Martha's arms and said in a voice that was small and clear, "Thank you. Bacon." Martha laughed through her tears, a short, broken, beautiful sound. She squeezed Fumiko once more and let go, and turned away quickly because she was a Texas woman, and Texas women had their own rules about crying in public. Noriko walked past Billy Crawford. She stopped. She looked at him with those fierce, dark eyes and said in Japanese, "Tell the doctor I will live, not because of you, but also not without you." Kazuko translated. Billy nodded slowly, understanding not the words but the weight behind them. He touched the brim of his hat with 2 fingers, the way a man salutes something he respects but cannot name. The women climbed into the trucks. The engines rumbled. The canvas flaps closed halfway, leaving strips of light and dust, in the last view of a ranch in Texas that had been their prison and their sanctuary, and the place where they learned that the word enemy was not as simple as they had been taught. Sachiko sat against the side of the truck and opened her diary. She wrote the last entry she would make on American soil. "I arrived as number 47. I leave as Sachiko. That is what they gave me. Not the dresses, not the medicine, not the stew or the bacon or the blankets on the cots. They gave me my name. And a name is not a small thing. A name is the difference between being a tool and being a person, between being used and being known, between disappearing and being remembered." The truck pulled away. Dust rose behind it, red and slow curling into the morning air. Almost every woman looked back. The barn was still there, the mess hall, the crooked fence, the porch where Tom and Martha stood together, not waving, just watching 2 figures growing smaller against the wide Texas sky. And the Cowboys' hats in hand, standing in a loose row beside the gate, changed too, whether they knew it or not, because you cannot witness someone reclaim their humanity without something shifting in your own. The trucks disappeared down the long, straight road. The dust settled. The ranch returned to its rhythms, cattle and fences and coffee at dawn. But something was different. Something would always be different. A barn that still smelled faintly of soap and hay. A hook on the wall where a mirror had hung. A stain on the wooden table where a pot of stew had been set down every night for 3 weeks. Small traces, invisible to anyone who did not know where to look. If this story moved you, please like the video and leave a comment telling us where in the world you are watching from. Thank you for remembering a piece of history the world nearly forgot. Now let us return to where we began. San Angelo, Texas, 2012, 67 years later. Jake McAllister sat in his grandfather's study, the diary open on the desk before him. He had read every page. He had looked up the words he did not understand. He had sat with the story for 3 days, letting it settle into him, the way rain settles into dry ground slowly, and then all at once. He called the law office in Yokohama. A woman answered. Her English was precise and slightly formal, the English of someone who had studied it carefully and practiced it often. Her name was Yumi Tanaka. She was 35 years old. She was a school teacher. She was Sachiko's granddaughter. Your grandmother, Jake said, and then stopped because he did not know how to finish the sentence. Your grandmother left everything to my family. I did not know she existed until last week. Yumi was quiet for a moment. Then she said, My grandmother talked about Texas every night before she slept. She said it was the place where she was born a second time. Jake asked, would you like to come here? To see the ranch, Yumi said yes. She said it the way a person says yes to something they have been waiting for their entire life without knowing they were waiting. In the autumn of 2012, Yumi Tanaka stood at the gate of the McAllister Ranch. The wooden posts were older, weathered to silver gray, but the gate was still wide. The pastures still rolled toward the horizon. The sky was still enormous, still blue, still the kind of sky that makes a person feel both small and infinite at the same time. Jake stood on the porch in the exact spot where his grandfather had stood 67 years before and watched a Japanese woman walk up the same dirt path that her grandmother had once walked in torn shoes and terror. Yumi carried two things: the wooden comb cracked down the middle, held together by a strip of cloth, and the diary. Jake led her through the ranch. The barn had been converted to a storage building long ago, but the bones of it were the same. The wooden walls, the high ceiling, the gaps between the boards where moonlight had once fallen in silver lines across the floor. Yumi stood in the center of the space and closed her eyes and breathed in the smell of old hay and dust and something else, something deeper, something that 67 years had not erased. The ghost of soap, the memory of stew. The echo of a harmonica played softly on a fence rail at dusk. She opened the diary to a page near the middle one she had marked with a red ribbon. She read aloud, translating her grandmother's Japanese into English as she went. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled. Today, the American woman who feeds us put extra bacon on the youngest girl's plate when she was not looking. She thinks no one sees. But I see. I see a woman whose grandson was killed by our people, who wakes before dawn every morning and cooks for the people connected to that death. She does not smile. She does not forgive. But she feeds us. And I think that maybe feeding someone you have every reason to hate is the bravest thing a person can do. Jake listened. He thought of his grandmother Martha, who had died in 2003 and who had never once mentioned the Japanese women to anyone in the family. He thought of his grandfather Tom, who had carried this story in silence for 42 years. He thought of the weight of secrets, not shameful secrets, but sacred ones. Stories too large and too complicated to survive the telling stories that could only be carried, never shared, until finally they were set down in a diary by a woman who understood that someone someday would need to read them. They drove to the cemetery on the edge of San Angelo. Tom and Martha were buried side by side beneath a live oak tree whose branches spread wide enough to shade both graves. The headstone was simple: Tom's name, Martha's name, the dates, and beneath Tom's name a single line that Martha had chosen after his death. He chose to be a man when it was easier to be a soldier. Yumi knelt beside the grave. She placed the broken comb on the grass between the two headstones. Beside it, she placed a paper sakura blossom she had brought from Japan, folded with the same precision her grandmother had used when folding bandages in the clinic on this very ranch. She bowed her head. She did not pray, or if she did, the prayer was silent. She stayed like that for a long time while the wind moved through the live oak and the shadows of its leaves played across the stone. Jake stood beside her. He did not speak. He did not need to. Some moments are too complete for words. Some stories end not with a sentence, but with a silence, the kind of silence that is not empty, but full, full of everything that was said and everything that was left unsaid and everything that passed between two families separated by war and joined by something the war could not destroy. When Yumi stood, she opened the diary to the last page. The final entry, written in a hand so shaky the characters were barely legible, dated January 2nd, 2012, 2 weeks before Sachiko died. Yumi translated, I have lived 88 years. For 86 of those years, I have lived with the name Sachiko, which a man in Texas gave back to me on an October morning in 1945. He did not know what he was doing. He just called me by my name. But for a woman who had lost everything, including herself, to be called by her name was to be born again. I was number 47. He made me Sachiko. That is the gift I carry. That is the story I leave behind. Not a story of war, not a story of cruelty, a story of a morning in Texas when a man in a dusty hat looked at a broken woman and called her ma'am, and in that single ordinary word gave her back the thing no army and no empire and no amount of suffering had been able to take completely. Her name, herself, her right to exist as a person in a world that had tried to erase her. Yumi closed the diary. She looked at Jake. He looked at her. Between them on the grass before the headstones lay a broken comb and a paper flower, and above them the Texas sky stretched wide and blue and endless. The same sky that Sachiko had looked at 67 years ago, when she first stepped off a truck and felt the dust beneath her feet and thought that she had come to the end of everything, only to discover slowly and painfully and beautifully that she had come to the beginning. That evening, Yumi and Jake stood on the porch of the ranch house. The sun was going down. The light turned the pastures to gold and the fence posts to amber and the distant cattle to dark silhouettes against a sky that burned from orange to crimson to a purple so deep it looked like the color of grief itself, if grief had a color, which it does, and it is exactly the color of a Texas sunset in autumn. On the porch rail between them lay the diary, the comb, and a photograph. The photograph was new, taken that afternoon. Two families, Tanaka and McAllister, standing together for the first time in 67 years. Behind them, the same barn, the same sky, the same land, different faces, same story. A story that began with hatred and ended with a name. A story that proved that mercy is not weakness, that kindness is not surrender, that feeding your enemy's granddaughter bacon on a Tuesday morning is an act of courage that echoes across generations and oceans and decades, and arrives finally at a porch in Texas where two strangers discover that they are not strangers at all, that they never were, that the thread connecting them was woven long ago by people who chose in the worst moment of their lives to be human. The mockingbird sang its last song of the evening. The stars came out one by one. And somewhere in a place that is not a place but a feeling, the 22-year-old woman in a cotton dress stood in a dusty yard and heard a man in a wide hat call her by her name. And she felt for the first time in years that she was real, that she was whole, that she was allowed to exist without being used, and that the broken pieces of who she had been were being gathered slowly and gently by hands that belonged to people who owed her nothing and gave her everything. They made them line up. And then they gave them back their names, and that more than any treaty or surrender or ceremony is how the war truly ended. Not on a battleship in Tokyo Bay, not in a document signed by generals, but in a barn in Texas where a cowboy handed a dress to a woman he did not know and said a word so small it could fit in the palm of your hand. Ma'am, that was enough. That was everything.